Ask Earl Anything 31. Remember, this show is all about your questions. The more questions I have, the longer the show goes. This week we got a nice group of questions from last week's show. Last week was Ask Earl Anything 30. Really was a fun show last week. I know I got into a couple things I probably shouldn't go into, and I won't go into today. Promise you that. I had a lot of fun also this past weekend being on Jeff Holden's show, Will Drum for Food. The 14 people that were in the chat asking questions and watching and taking it all in. I thought that was awesome live. But I think there's some people that watched the show after the fact. Jeff and I just had a kind of fun chemistry together. So I just want to thank Jeff for having me on his show and getting the opportunity to share a little bit of my knowledge with you guys. As you know, I have a certain level of knowledge about drums. Been doing this a little while in life, and I enjoy sharing my knowledge with you. I'm probably going to go back to doing some drum talks about things like Gretsch drums and cymbals again. But this show really is an opportunity for you guys to ask me questions about things that are important to you. So I appreciate your questions, and I don't take them lightly, and I'll try to give each question the due course it deserves. So let's start at the end, my last question. My last question comes from a new viewer. Thanks for the peanut sauce. It is really good. I really dig that name. Thanks for the peanut sauce. It is really good. He asks, what are your thoughts on a flat ride cymbals and vented hi-hats? Well, I love flat ride cymbals. I have two of them. One is a traditional Paiste flat ride, and it's an 18-inch, and the other one is a Sabian signature Ed Thigpen flat ride, which is kind of made in the HH cymbal vein. Both have a very dry, unique sound. The thing about flat rides is they don't build up like a regular ride cymbal with a bell has more like sustain, and it's not as dry, and the way they dried it out was taking the bell out. So flat rides have got that really nice definition to them, okay? But they don't have that really, they're not really loud cymbals, and they're not fun to crash on because they have no real crashability to them. So I really like having a flat ride. It's just a certain voice that works with certain players and certain types of music. So if you're playing Pat Metheny music, you gotta have flat rides. If you're playing a jazz gig, having a flat ride is a nice ride cymbal sound to go to once in a while. So yeah, it's kind of cool. Now, as far as vented hi-hats go, I assume you mean sound edge hi-hats or the quick beat hi-hats of the Zildjians of the 80s and the Sabian flat hats, which has a flat cymbal on the bottom and some holes drilled in the bottom. I have one of those flat cymbals for my Sabian 13-inch hi-hats, and it has some holes drilled in it. I like them. I would love to have a set of Sound Edge 505 hats, or, well, they don't make giant beats that way, so that ain't gonna happen. But 2002 Sound Edges, they're great cymbals. I think they really add to the chick. It's less likely to get airlocked, which does happen if you don't adjust your hi-hat properly. So that's one of the things you want to work on if you've got a pair of hi-hats that are not vented, is you want to not get that airlock thing going on where it kind of sounds choked. But I think they're great. I think I'd love to have a set of Sound Edge hi-hats for the Paistes. And Zildjian makes their Master Sound hats and the quick beats with the holes in the bottom. So the holes in the bottom just dries out the cymbal a little bit. Not so much on the quick beats. I think the dryness of that is the flat cymbal on the bottom. Interesting, one of the Sabian artists of a long time ago was Harvey Mason. And Harvey Mason had a set of hats that were really dry too. But he had his flat cymbal on the top. And they were called EQ hats. And Sabian made them for years with a flat top cymbal. So Harvey liked that really dry kind of hi-hat sound. So if that's your thing, I think you can really get that out of those EQ hats. And if you want that better chick, try the Sound Edge or the the flat bottoms, which are the flat hats, or the new quick beat hats by Zildjian. Those all work. That's a really good question. I dig all those things. Mr. Peanut Sauce. I don't know what else to call you. Thanks for the peanut sauce. It is really good. I appreciate that question. All right, my next question comes from 2112 Drums. And he says, what are your thoughts on swish cymbals? Well, swish cymbals are different than China cymbals, technically. There's actually 3 types of China cymbal types. There's Chinas, there's swish cymbals, and then there's a cymbal called a pang cymbal. And you really don't see pang cymbals today, but back in the 70s, my favorite drummer, Danny Serafine, used to play a 20-inch pang cymbal. And a pang cymbal is a cymbal that's got a bow to it, and then it flattens out. Just flattens out on the edge. Kind of like the sound control cymbals of Sabians, but it's a little bit more Chinese sounding. I think it's a little longer, the flat edge. China cymbals have this kind of bell on them that you can grab, and Chinese cymbals, like being the classic Wuhans, you could actually hold this part. That's what they were designed for, so you can actually pick it up and hold it. Now, Paiste didn't do that. That's just the shape of their China bell. A swish has got more of a normal bell on it, but it's got the turned up edges. And Zildjian makes a cymbal called a swish knocker. And a swish knocker is a big cymbal usually, and it's got like 20 rivets in it. And I have one of these. They sound really dark and really kind of dark and nasty. You know, I think the swish knockers were used by a lot of big band guys like Peter Erskine and Mel Lewis back in the day, because you could ride on it and get that really dark sound out of an A Zildjian. So another guy that really likes that swish sound is John Robinson. He's got a Paiste 24-inch swish made with him for him, which has all the rivets in it too. So anyhow, I like swish cymbals. I just think there's only place for usually one of them or so, but you can tell I'm a cymbal nut. So I have 5 China cymbals that are mine: an 18-inch 2002 16-inch Paiste Signature, an 18-inch Tosco China, which is more of like a Zildjian swish cymbal, to be honest. I've got a 20-inch Wuhan China, and I've got the 22-inch swish knocker, which is a swish cymbal. So, and I've had quite a few in my life. Matter of fact, I sold a 22-inch swish cymbal when I was in college for I don't know what I got for it, maybe $80 for it or something. But to pay my wife's phone bill when we were talking on the phone collect from, I was in college and I was calling her on a payphone out on Kennedy Boulevard in Jersey City, because we didn't have cell phones back in those days, so I had to go out to the payphone and make a phone call to call my girlfriend. So she was my girlfriend at that time. Anyhow, it's kind of funny story. Next question comes from Bill Morehouse. Hey Bill, how you doing? And he asks, common wisdom is that usually the drummer should be like hand in glove with the bass player. Obviously things change depending on what you're going on at each moment in the music, but I want to ask you for your opinion on this bit of common wisdom, at least concerning the types of music you typically play. All right. I do think the drummer and the bass player try to lock in, but I've never been religious with locking with the bass player. I really key more off the guitar player, believe it or not, where the guitar player is going and the vocal more than the bass player. So the bass player kind of finds my foot thing. Of course, if you're playing funk and there's a certain funk pattern, you want to be exact with it. But a lot of singer-songwriter stuff, I'm more vibing on the guitar part and kind of playing along with that. And the bass player can kind of play some more of that melodic line stuff, and it's less rhythmically has to be there. But if you're playing like fusion jazz or funk jazz or funk or R&B, the bass line becomes a very important part of it, and you got to lock in. And then it's just a matter of really finding that spot, and you guys are holding the time down. In straight ahead jazz, the bass player is driving the song. I mean, it's very important that you're playing your ride cymbal more with the bass player than what your foot's doing. So like when you're playing like straight ahead kind of jazz, it's doing doom 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 ding boom bing 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 boom 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 bing boom bing ba doom boom. You know, you got to be on the cymbal driving with him, and you're pulsating with the bass player. So each style of music has its own thing, but I find in most of my pop rock settings that I play in, or Christian worship settings, the bass player can be hammering the root, you know, and almost not be doing anything. Now, if you're playing with a good bass player, I start to really listen. The problem is there's a lot of guys that think they're bass players and they're not. And the difference is when you play with a real bass player, it makes all the difference in the world. I'm not talking about guitar players that are acting as bass players. I'm talking about real bass players. I have a couple friends that are like real bass players, and when I get the opportunity to play with a real bass player that's their only instrument is playing bass, they play differently than guitar players that are bass players. So I'm not dissing any guitar players out there, but most guitar players can say they play bass, but they also say they play drums usually too. Just so you know that. Everybody plays drums today. But when you're playing with a real bass player, they don't get in your way and they drive you, so you end up wanting to lock with them. So I don't know. It depends on the style of music, but I'm not religious with a bass player, especially if he's not a great bass player, where I'm going to be really listening to that. If I'm playing in a more rock, contemporary worship setting, where the bass players are just hammering roots and doing that dun 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 dun, that doesn't do anything for me, so I'll just play the quarter note on the kick drum, 1 and 3, or straight 4 on the floor, and usually that's driving it enough and staying with the click. But if you're playing in a funk setting where the bass player's popping and doing all that stuff, different ball game. Or if you're playing in a singer-songwriter setting where the bass player knows how to really meld with the chords, then it becomes a different thing, and that's usually a real bass player. So I guess I'm delineating real bass players. I get excited, my ears perk up, and my bass drum starts to lock more with them, and I'm really conscious of them. When I'm playing with the guy who's just hanging on for dear life, hitting the root chords and not really driving anything, I make them follow me more than me try to follow them and lock with them. And that's probably because they're not really driving bass players. But when you play with a great bass player, it changes everything, I will tell you that. All right. My next question comes from my friend Mike Frazano. Hi Mike, how you doing? And Mike asks a great question. He says, do you use a metronome app in any live gigs on an iPhone or an iPad? And if so, which do you prefer? The app I use is called Tempo. It's pretty cool, it works for me, and it's what I need to do. I use the same app, Mike. I have used Pro Metronome, and I know there's a couple other really great metronomes for doing all kinds of crazy polyrhythmic stuff. But for the most part, what I do playing in churches and stuff, I can program the song off my iPad or my phone, right, having it next to me, and I can pull up my Tempo app, and usually there's a playlist. I put a playlist together, and I can just go from one playlist to the next. So let's see if I have a set list gig here. I do. So, you know, it's 161. I go to the next song. Tempo changes. It's slower. You definitely tell it's a worship set. But yeah, that's what I do. You got me. I put my finger in my ear, Mike, just so you know. You can call that tick out. Tempo is a great metronome app for a worship set or a set list of songs. If you got 15 songs, you can program all the songs on here and go one to the next and put the tempos in. And if you've got some kind of a headphone setup, you can actually interject your click into it and play along with it. I've done a lot of church gigs where I'm playing along to a metronome that I'm running, and the band does. And then if the band has to dump, I can dump them out by hitting the big button on it. Now, it's a lot harder on the iPhone than the iPad. I will tell you that. But I've done the church thing with the iPhone just as much as with the iPad. And you know, the big thing when you're working with a metronome with a band is if the band goes off, you got to be sensitive to it, and you got to dump the click. That's what I've learned to do. It's kind of hard to trudge through it. Now, if you're playing with a track, that'll change things. They all have to find themselves again, so you have to stay with the track. It's a lot harder to dump a track when you know the whole band's going to be gone when you dump the track in a church setting. But with the click, I've dumped the click before because people are off. It just doesn't make sense. So, but Tempo is a great app, metronome app, no doubt about it. All right, my next question comes from 2112 Drums, and he asks, "What's your opinion on vented snares? Not the ones with the single air vent, but the ones with the massive chunks of shell taken out." All right, I do have an opinion on this one. First off, all drums need some venting of air, okay? But there was a time a few years ago where, what was it? Orange County Percussion made a drum for Guitar Center that had all these holes drilled through the shell. It was just like air coming into it. It sounded terrible. It had no pop to it because the big vent took out the space. But I have seen vented drums that do work, like the Hinger Touchtone drum, which is from the 70s, which actually was a drum that can go from being like a 5-inch drum and it had these like little side, it was kind of like a little side, what would you call it, grooves, and the shell would lift up to a 10 by 14. So go like from a 5 by 14 to a 10 by 14, and you could adjust it and kind of lock down with some screws or something what size drum you wanted to have. But again, with that big hole, it doesn't have the pop of a 10 by 14, but it gives you that big deeper sound because you've got the difference of sound between the top head and the bottom head. So I'm not a big fan of the vented drums, the hugely vented drums. I think they take a little bit too much out of the sound of the drum for my taste. But I mean, if you just put one big hole in, Premier made a drum called what did they call that drum? They had a hole on the side and had a place for your SM57 to go into it. It was kind of an interesting thing. There was a hole in the 57 would go in the hole. It was a way of doing close miking on the side of the shell. By the way, some guys like to mic their drums on the side of the shell, not have it on the head, or they'll have one on the head and one on the shell and one on the bottom head. You can get crazy with miking techniques, that's for sure. But yeah, I think the vented drums just kind of take a lot of the ballsiness of the drum out. So for me, I'm not a big fan of a vented drum, so I'm not going to go out and pretty much buy one. If one dropped in my lap, I may use it. There may be a use for it. But Ludwig made this drum called the Coliseum drum, which was a slotted drum. Okay? And again, I think it didn't have the same balls of a 7 by 14 or an 8 by 14, which is what I think their size of that drum was. It was pretty deep. It just didn't have the same ballsiness because of that vent. That vent just takes a lot of the sound out. So, but the vented one that Guitar Center was selling, that drum, I just noticed how weak it sounded. It sounded wimpy, that drum. So maybe somebody watching today might have a comment about how that works exactly, but that's my approximation of how it works. All right, next question comes from 2112 Drums, and thank you 2112 Drums for asking questions. He had two questions, okay? So the first question was, have you ever owned any cymbals with jingles on them? And I assume you're talking about like tambourine jingles. And I will tell you that I made two cymbals with tambourine jingles. One was my flat Sabian hi-hat cymbal, which I drilled some holes in, and I put in rivets and attached a jingle to the bottom. And they sounded like jingle pads. They were jingle. And the other one was kind of a China cymbal I had. It's in my first Peisty video. It's a Swish cymbal, 22-inch, and I put 6 jingles on that drum with rivets. Put a rivet through it, split rivet, copper split rivet through the jingle in the hole and split it. And it had a unique sound. Left the strange little big circle marks where the jingles were. But I didn't think it was cool enough to keep it, you know what I mean? So I got rid of that cymbal. And when I got rid of it, I had already taken out the jingles. So the only one I ever used the jingles on is the bottom of that hi-hat, and it gives a real sizzle. It's like zzz, like high-pitched sizzle sound to it. So, but it's a unique drum for sure, no doubt about that one. The next one is from 2112 Drums. I'm just gonna make sure it's not the same one. Oh, it is. There it is. He asks, do you own any acrylites, Ludwig acrylites? And the answer to that question is not anymore. I owned one acrylite drum in my life, and I will tell you the story of the acrylite drum. I was in a band in the late 70s, and the guy had a Ludwig acrylite. He gave me the drum. It was 5x14. I never liked the sound of it, to be honest. It never did anything for me. This was before acrylites were the thing. Now, I don't think I was as good a drum tuner either at that point. If you had an acrylite, it wasn't like having a superphonic, even though they have the same shell type. Superphonic always sounded better than an acrylite. It's still that Ludloy shell, that aluminum shell, but I just never thought that they sounded that good. So I had a 1960s Keystone Badge 8-lug acrylite, and I wasn't doing anything with it. And one day I got a phone call from a recording studio in town that I was trying to get some session work at. A guy named Joe Saint, Emmaus Sound Studio. And he had a guy came in and he needed some percussion on a track. And he said, I want timbales. I didn't have any timbales. But I had an acrylite snare drum that I didn't do anything with. So I took the snares off, I took the bottom head off, and I brought the acrylite snare to the session. I brought a shaker and a whistle and a couple other percussion toys. And I overdubbed some percussion for him and played some blat de blats, some of these timbale riffs off the thing, you know. Those kind of triplet things. I had a cowbell too. Of course, that's not a good cowbell. But anyhow, it was a great timbale. And I used it as a timbale, and I never really put the bottom heads back on. And then one day, I left the drum at my Asbury house before I sold my Asbury house. I moved to brick. We had a renter in there who was going to buy the house. The renter didn't buy the house, so I had to rent it again. And I had to clean the house out. And I was down in that basement cleaning it out. And that acrylite shell and a Gretsch bass drum that I had taken in parts. I actually still have the rims to that Gretsch bass drum. It was a 20-inch bass drum with this really nasty white swirl finish that was all cracked. I was going to refinish it one day, but it was just the shell. I took all the lugs off of it, so I've got the lugs still to this day. Some of these lugs are the size of this floor tom in a coffee can. And I took that shell and that acrylite shell and I threw it to the curb. So that's where my acrylite ended up at. I've done some dumb things in my life. I don't know why I didn't take it home and why I didn't keep it. I didn't really have space for it at the time, probably. That was part of it. I still to this day don't know why I tossed that shell. But this was before eBay, right before eBay started. So this is like 1995, I guess. And eBay really didn't start till 97 from what I remember. And I didn't know anybody I was going to buy that shell for me. But as soon as eBay showed up, boy, everything changed. And I got some shells that were stripped from another friend in a trade, and I sold them on eBay, you know. I even sold this. I had this Gretsch drum, this 6.5x14 Gretsch. It was a 3-ply Gretsch, okay, because it was maple inside. It didn't have the silver sealer in it, and it had the micro sensitive throw off with the broken arm. The funny thing was when I bought it, there's like a little, it's like a little arm on the strainer, and it was missing. So I bought this drum for $30. I went home in my junky basement in Asbury Park, and I found a little arm off of some other instrument this guy had collected junk in my house, and I found it in one of my piles of crap. And I screwed it in and it fit perfectly, and I fixed the microsensitive strainer. It even looked like it belonged. And I hated that drum. Drum sounded terrible. The bearing edges weren't right or something. That's when I had this opinion about Gretsch drums, Gretsch wooden snare drums, that they weren't that good, because they really didn't sound good to me. I never had a Gretsch wooden snare drum that sounded good until I took my Gretsch wooden snare drum that's in this over here in this room. I know you can't see that today because I took it out of the picture. But I bought one to match my kit because I didn't buy it with my kit. And it never sounded good till my friend Dan at DMR Drums cut the bearing edges. And when he recut the bearing edges with the snare bed, that drum sounds great to this day. But this drum with the micro-sensitive strainer on it, and it was black, it was like a black diamond pearl. I tore that drum apart. I took all the wrap off. I was going to refinish it, and I eventually sold that shell for like $30 on eBay. That one came with me. And I just wrecked the drum I could have probably sold for $250 easy today. So I've done some really dumb things like that, I will tell you that. So you can really destroy stuff if you're not sure what you're doing. But I bought it for $30 and I got $30 for the shell. I will tell you that the rims I've put on other drums. I've used actually I used the castings on that 6.5 by 10 inch tom. I drilled the holes for that and I made a double-headed tom. That was a concert tom. And then I eventually took that little drum to Resurrection Drums and they did the edges, and that drum came to life too. So you really have to have good bearing edges, whatever you're doing. But yeah, anyhow, as far as the acrylite goes, I had one for a while. That's the only acrylite I've ever had in my life. I was looking at a 6.5 by 14 acrylite. I think they sound great. But to be honest, this drum right here, my cast aluminum drum, sounds like a beefed up Superphonic and an acrylite all in one. So I don't see me needing aluminum drums. So that's really the reason why I haven't. It's really the reason why I haven't bought one. It's got that aluminum ballsiness to it, which is what I look for. And this cast aluminum drum just, I think it's better than an acrylite or a Superphonic. But I know Jeremy at Little Drummer Channel would probably disagree with me because he got a beautiful 6.5 by 14 acrylite with the hammering in it. So, I mean, I think they're pretty drums. But I think this drum goes right in that same space of aluminum drums. All right. And I think this is the last question. And the last question is by Brian Corey. And Brian Corey asked, for next week, out of all the shows you played in your career, which was your favorite and the most fun? Well, you know, I had a lot of fun gigs I've played in my lifetime. I've done big stages. I played at Creation Fest in 1990 with a band. We were on a big stage for 10,000 people. The album I did live, in 2014 was a great night and an experience that I'll never probably get to do again in my life, and I love that opportunity to play that show. But some of my favorite gigs were done with friends, and they were small gigs, you know what I mean? And with my wife, playing weddings with my wife, or just playing pickup wedding gigs with my friend John and Sandy Houston and my wife, and Dave Jones, my friend, playing guitar. We had lots of fun nights playing worship music at a little church and on Saturday nights with David back in the 90s. So I've had so many gigs that I really enjoyed playing. I think that the most memorable gigs are the ones I played with great players and having the opportunity to play with great players. Because, when you play with some really monstrous players, it changes things for you. And I've been blessed to play with some great players down here in South Florida, some great players in New Jersey. I mean, one of my favorite gigs in New Jersey I ever did, I was just the sub drummer, was this band called String Bean and the Stalkers. And it basically was two guitar players, Sonny Kin and String Bean. That's where the name String Bean came from. I forget his real name. String Bean played harmonica and acoustic guitar. Sonny Kin was like the local guitar hero pre-Bruce Springsteen. He was like in that same era of Bruce and those bands back in the 60s and 70s before Bruce became huge. And a bass player named David Myers. And we used to play at this Cajun restaurant for $25 and a meal at the end of the gig. And I was the sub drummer. I wasn't the main drummer. And that gig, when David Myers couldn't play the gig, a guy named Lee, what's his last name? Oh gosh. He's the bass player for Blondie today. He was, at that point in time, he was just going to be the bass player for Blondie. And it was before Blondie went back on the road in the late 90s. And he had gotten the gig, and he was waiting around for them to go on the road. And he had nothing to do. He was living in a beach house with his brother or something in Belmar. And we had a gig in Belmar at this little Cajun restaurant. And he would get called. He would come in, and I played with him a couple times. David Myers was a great bass player. That guy Lee from the Blondie's bass player was a great bass player. I mean, I played with some monster bass players. You know, when you play with a great bass player, it just changes everything. You know, that's what I'm talking about. When you're playing blues with a bass player can really play the blues and doesn't get in the way of anything and just is laying it down. And this gig was just kick, snare, cymbal, and hi-hat. That was the gig. You really didn't bring toms and stuff. You just played cymbal and hi-hat. Anyhow, those were some of my favorite gigs. Those were some of my favorite gigs I ever played, was playing with just great players. So all I can say to you is when you get the opportunity to play with great musicians, that trumps the big stages even in some respects. Because you're playing with guys who know. You know you're getting, your bar is raising that day. And I would say playing with great musicians brings your best playing out. You know? And that's what I always look to do, is can I bring my best playing out? I had a guy down here, a guitar player down here named Michael Terrell. He played on my wife's album a couple of tracks. I mean, I played a bunch of gigs with him in town. I used to play youth group stuff with him. He was the youth leader at this church. He used to be on the road with a band called Mile and Lefevre and Broken Heart. And I would play djembe with him, and we jam. But then we did these nights of worship where it was just him and a bass player and a keyboard player and myself. And we would just go 5 hours playing. It was awesome stuff. So I've had the opportunity to work with really good musicians, and those are all memorable gigs to me. Those are all memorable experiences playing with people. So it's not just the big stages. It's the career. It's the things, the people you've touched during your career, and when you've gotten the opportunity to do those types of playing, that's really cool. So anyhow, thank you for watching Ask Earl Anything. Please subscribe. More importantly, leave comments, talk about the show, ask questions for the next show. And until next week, thank you for watching.